Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the president's house, it's the people's house. No modern president has had more of an impact on the White House than Harry Truman. When he moved into the White House in 1945, the building was practically in danger of falling down around him.
Before the restoration took place, they had stabilized the second floor by running steel rods, steel cables, down from the roof through the floor to hold it up so they could get everything out, furniture, people, all of that. And Grandpa took photographers and reporters on a tour of the second floor to show them how bad it was and discuss what might be done. And he stopped outside his bathroom, and one of those steel rods had been run down through the floor next to the toilet. And Grandpa turned to the reporters and said, this thing scares me. I'm going to be sitting in here some night and hit the plunger and wind up in the state dining room. And he added that the band would probably play Hail to the Chief as he came through the ceiling.
In this episode, Stuart McLaurin talks to President Truman's grandson, Clifton Daniel, about how President Truman both modernized and preserved the White House for future generations, and shares his personal memories of his grandparents during their retirement from the presidency.
Welcome to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association, and we have a very special podcast this month for President's Day today. And actually today in Independence, Missouri at the Harry Truman Library, we're launching the 2018 White House Christmas ornament featuring President Harry Truman and his years in the White House. This is a very important day for the association, and President Truman is a very important president to us all year. We'll have a number of opportunities to focus on his life, leadership, and legacy during his years in the White House. Today, we'll be talking about a very important impact that he had on the White House itself and discussing the major renovations on the White House that occurred during his presidency. And I have very happy to share with you that we have a really special guest joining us by telephone from Florida today. We're talking to Clifton Truman Daniel, the oldest son of Margaret Truman and Clifton Daniel, and a grandson to Harry S. Truman and Bess Truman. And Clifton will be sharing his own memories of his grandfather, as well as how President Truman's renovations transformed and preserved the White House for future generations. Thank you for joining us today, Clifton.
My pleasure, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Clifton, we're honored to have you joining us later this month in Washington for a talk on February 28th. That talk is open to the public, and we'd encourage everyone to attend. There's information on our website, whitehousehistory.org, and hope everyone listening to this podcast can join us on February the 28th. So today we look forward to hearing about the Truman renovation, as well as your own recollections and personal experiences related to your grandfather. So let's delve directly into that. How did your grandparents, Harry and Bess Truman, first learn about the really perilous state of the White House and its physical condition when they moved in after President Roosevelt's death?
Well, I think it was a couple of things, Stuart. Mrs. Roosevelt was actually very upfront about the condition of the White House. She and President Roosevelt had not felt during his years in office that it was a good idea to spend a lot of money on their own comfort, since we were in the middle of a depression and later on a war. So they were comfortable enough letting the living quarters go. When President Roosevelt died, my grandfather did not rush Mrs. Roosevelt at all. He told her to take all the time she needed to get their belongings together and move out. And they stayed in Blair House across the street. And Mrs. Roosevelt, on her way out, stopped in Blair House to talk to my grandparents and told them how bad it was. And she even told them about the rat problem. And apparently the First Lady and 3 or 4 of her friends were having lunch on the south portico, and a huge rat scampered across the railing. And according to Mrs. Roosevelt and my grandfather, all the ladies pretended not to see it.
That's a great story. We actually did a Facebook post on rats and such things at the White House. There's quite a history there. Yes.
Oh. Well, it was that, and my grandfather joked for a couple of years about the creaking and popping at the White House when he was alone in there. my grandmother would go back and forth to Missouri to take care of her own mother and family affairs. And my grandfather was alone in the White House particularly. He wrote to her and to my mother reporting the popping and creaking and the drapes moving back and forth. He said it was other ex-presidents wandering the halls arguing with each other. I think he said it was Andy Jackson and Teddy Roosevelt arguing about Franklin Roosevelt.
I've often thought about what it would be like when a president is there walking through those halls alone and feeling the connectivity with those who have walked those floors before them. So that's a very special story. It relates to the renovation of the White House, of course, and what came after. But before the major renovation, there was another controversial addition to the White House that was made by your grandfather. And it's actually a featured element of this year's White House Christmas ornament and has been, although controversial at the time, has become very important to first families today. Tell us about that.
Well, Grandpa had always thought two things. He had always thought that a president's family should have some place where they can sit outside on a nice day and be private, just have a private place they could be outside without all the falderall. So that was one part of it. The other part was that up until the construction of what became known as the Truman Balcony, the south portico, the columns had been broken up by awning. Grandpa hated those awnings. He said it made the thing look ridiculous. And he thought that a nice, solid balcony up there with a railing would look much better. And he got a lot of resistance to that, both from Congress and from the folks who, from historians, and a lot of pushback. And he could not get the money out of Congress to do it. So being a man who was used to saving money and being careful with his money, he had saved enough out of his own household budget to pay for it. So he went ahead and paid for it. And that's how it got done. And eventually it came to be a loved and respected element of the White House.
It certainly has. And I think every first family since your grandparents would thank them if they had the opportunity to, because it gives them a family space where you go out from the residence level and you can see across the ellipse to the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument, and it's a place of peacefulness and solitude that's theirs.
Yeah.
It's a nice place for the first family to be able to go. But you mentioned Mrs. Roosevelt and what she shared about the condition of the White House, and there was a lot going on at that time. Maybe there was not thinking that this was a priority for expenditure or to get done. It was a daunting responsibility to decide how to address this crumbling White House. So when and how did he determine that this absolutely needed to be done?
It was around the time of his whistle-stop campaign and election to office in his own right, 1948. And I believe the Reconstruction started in 49, but it was leading up to that. There were a couple of different instances, but it had become apparent not only to my grandfather, but to engineers. Mm-hmm. I mean, he ordered, jokes about ghosts aside, he ordered inspections of the premises. And the engineers became very concerned. And my grandfather's, one of his stories were that they had a ceremony in the East Room, and as the color guard was marching across the floor, Grandpa could see the chandeliers quivering. And eventually, one of those chandeliers, Grandpa had invited the pianist Eugene List. Mr. List, as a sergeant in the Army, had played for Grandpa and for Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam. And Grandpa invited him to the White House to give a concert. And during the concert, the engineers came to Grandpa and told him that the chandelier over their heads was hanging by a thread, that the chain was stretching. And I think that thing weighed, you'll know better than I, probably 1,400 pounds. And Grandpa said it was a fine time to tell me, and I decided to let the concert go on, but it could have come down on everybody. Wow. There was one more incident, which I learned as a child, sitting next to my mother at the family piano in New York. You're Harry Truman's grandson, you have to take piano lessons. Everybody in the family has to know how to play the piano. So I took lessons, and I was a terrible student. I was a cheat, and what I used to do was, if I couldn't read the music fast enough or I couldn't do my homework very well, I would ask my mother to sit down and play it for me because she could sight read music and just play it right off the bat. And I used to sit next to her and watch her fingers. While she was giving me help with my piano studies one day, she told me the story of the leg of her own piano in her sitting room upstairs punching through the floor. And I believe it dropped the ceiling in the family dining room about 1.5 feet. So the chandelier, the floor, it was time to do something.
Wasn't there also a bathtub story?
Yeah, there were a couple of different versions of that. The one I heard first, I heard the bathtub story through you guys at the White House Historical Association, but the one I heard as an adult from a photographer, a New York Times photographer named George Thames, and George had covered every president since Roosevelt. And early on, before the restoration took place, they had stabilized the second floor by running steel rods, steel cables, I guess, down from the roof through the floor to hold it up so they could get everything out, furniture, people, all of that. And Grandpa took Mr. Thames and other photographers and reporters on a tour of the second floor to show them how bad it was and discuss what might be done. And he stopped outside his bathroom, and one of those steel rods had been run down through the floor next to the toilet. And Grandpa turned to the reporters and said, this thing scares me. I'm going to be sitting in here some night and hit the plunger and wind up in the state dining room. And he added that the band would probably play Hail to the Chief as he came through the ceiling.
That's great. Well, the renovation was undertaken and we started the work on the White House, but the president was concerned about the exterior walls and maintaining the integrity of those walls to be seen by passersby and people across the country and even internationally through the media. What lengths did he go to preserve those walls during this, what proved to be about a 4-year renovation project?
Right. You're right. He thought that was very important, just as they did in 1814 when the British burned the White House. They rebuilt it back very quickly as a national symbol, and Grandpa felt the same way about the White House. He wanted to preserve the outer walls. And one of the stories I like about the lengths that he went to, after they had gutted the White House down to those stone walls and begun, building the steel infrastructure inside, they needed to bring heavy equipment into the shell to dig the basements, to dig the new basement levels. And what they wanted to do that was to knock out some of the original stone, because the opening they had wasn't wide enough, so they wanted to knock out some of the original stone, widen the opening so they could drive trucks and bulldozers in there, and Grandpa wouldn't let them. He insisted that they take the bulldozers and the trucks apart and rebuild them inside to do the work until they could dig down far enough below the stone so that the opening would be wide enough to just drive them in and out, which they did after that.
There's amazing photography available through our website and our digital library to see these images. If you were to open the front door, the north door of the White House, and look down a couple of levels to the dirt beneath, and the interior of the White House is a complete empty shell, really. And, of course, careful notation was made of every item and element in the White House to be replaced. But these are incredible photographic images to see the machinery that you describe as being taken apart and moved in, to see it there operating inside the White House. You spoke earlier of Mrs. Roosevelt visiting your grandparents at the Blair House prior to moving into the White House. And there was a time when the construction began that they had to move back to the Blair House. I think they thought they might be able to stay at first in the White House as it was undergoing this renovation, but it actually required them to move out for several years. How different was it for President Truman to actually operate as president from across the street at Blair House versus in the White House?
I have the sense that it was sort of a mixed bag, but in many ways he appreciated it. He didn't have the White House to conduct business in, the state dinners and events. He didn't have the symbol, which he thought was important. But Blair House was an easier place to entertain, smaller. As a place to live, it was more like a home. It was a little cozier. And he really was, I think, relieved of some of the duties that would be incumbent on a president who had the full White House at his disposal, some of the events and state dinners. So they couldn't do as much with Blair House. But I think that was okay with my grandparents. That was more what they were used to. They were homebodies, essentially, and they were more used to having a comfortable place to live.
And, of course, the West Wing was still intact, was not impacted, and so the staff could operate there, and he could just walk across the street and be in the West Wing and the staff offices.
Walk across the street with all of his Secret Service agents and police and whatnot.
Exactly.
It was a heck of a walk.
You bring up the Secret Service agents. There was a sad incident that actually occurred while he was staying in Blair House. Tell us about that.
The two Puerto Rican nationals attempted to assassinate my grandfather. They came at the front door of Blair House from opposite ends of the block and opened fire. And they killed a White House policeman, Leslie Caufelt. And Mr. Caufelt, in turn, killed one of them. They never made it to the front door. And other agents opened fire as well. And, of course, Grandpa heard the commotion. He was taking a nap in his upstairs bedroom. He heard the commotion and stuck his head out the window.
Oh, my.
And they had to yell at him, get back in, and he did. It rattled my grandparents, and not my grandfather so much. He could shake things like that off, but it rattled my mother and my grandmother.
Well, at the time, the White House police and certainly the U.S. Secret Service today are a really important part of life in and around the White House, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude.
Yes.
And certainly the sad occasion of the loss of life. Leslie Caufelt is actually now remembered at Blair House through a conference room dedicated in his name. So it's a nice tribute to his sacrifice. How did President Truman stay apprised of the construction? Did he walk over there and take a look? Was he deeply involved in that process?
Yes, I almost want to say he could be a pain. Yeah, he was very interested. He did go over regularly to see how things were doing and talk to people. He probably wasn't a pain because he enjoyed that. He enjoyed people in general, and he was interested in what they were doing. So I'm sure that he took care not to be too much of a thorn in their side. But he was very interested, particularly in the when he could find them, the Mason's marks on the stones, because he was a Freemason. So finding actual Mason's marks on the stones, and he sent a piece of stone from the White House to every Grand Lodge, every Masonic Grand Lodge in the country, all 50 states.
The cornerstone that was laid in 1792 has never been located or found. Was there an effort during this construction
to
find
that? That's exactly it. It's amazing to me that they never could find the cornerstone.
Still to this day, it's a mystery.
And, of course, nobody was around to take a picture of George Washington laying it, so nobody knows where it is.
So I understand that as a young man, you actually had the opportunity to visit and stay in Blair House. Tell us what you remember from those times.
I was very young. I was 7 years old. We were there for Lyndon Johnson's inauguration in January of 1965. And I remember being fascinated because there's so many rooms in that house. It was fun to play hide and seek in Blair House. My brother William and I sort of ran free in there when the nanny couldn't catch us. But we had a nice time over there. But I went back to Blair and Lee House once when I was older, during the Watergate hearings. My dad in the 70s was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and he took us, my brother Will and me, to hear Jeb Magruder's testimony in the Watergate hearings. And we sat in there for about an hour and listened. Then we ran by Blair House. He'd made arrangements to give us a quick tour because we hadn't been back since I was 7. We hadn't been back. This is when I was probably 15, 16 years old. So he took us back over there, and they were expecting a visit from Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union at that time. So they apologized. They said, we don't have anybody that can show you around because we're going nuts trying to get this ready. And Dad said, that's all right. If you don't mind, we'll just wander through by ourselves. He knew it well enough to be able to give us a short tour. And near the end of that little tour, and I think it was upstairs in Lee House next door, he found a couple of Russian security guys looking under the bed and under tables and things for bugs, listening devices. And Dad, who worked in Russia in the 1950s, knew enough Russian to stick his head in the door and say good morning at the top of his lungs. And one of those guys came up and hit his head on the table.
I'm sure it startled.
I thought we were going to get shot by Russian security agents.
Wow, that's a terrific memory. Well, certainly as a grandson of a president, in any part of a presidential family, you are part of a small, unique group of people in our nation's history. Was there a time when you realized what it meant to be the grandson of a president of the United States, and did you realize that was different than other friends your age?
Weirdly, when I was very young, where I lived and where I went to school, I was in class with the sons of bankers and lawyers, doctors, very high-powered people. Walter Cronkite's son, Chip, was a classmate. So a president's grandson didn't stand out that much. It was not apparent to me that I was all that different. And of course, going back a little bit, the fun part of that is that my parents didn't tell me early on that my grandfather had been president of the United States. I found out in school.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Well, the joke being, thank God it was first grade and not high school. But I went to school one morning, and my teacher said, "Wasn't your grandfather president?" And I said, "I don't know." And I went home and I asked my mother. I dropped my book bag at the door, and I marched across the room. And I stood in front of her with my hands on my hips, and I said, "Mom, did you know that Grandpa Truman had been president of the United States?" And she looked at me and she said, "Yes, but just remember something. Any little boy's grandfather can be president.
Wow.
Don't let it go to your head."
What a great statement.
So as a small child, Grandpa was Grandpa. It was fun being around him because you went in the back door at all the events. You got seats up front. Everybody treated you nice. And later on, when he had the Secret Service protection after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, you had Secret Service around you, which was kind of cool. You were talking about them earlier. For me, it was like having a bunch of heavily armed uncles. They were great. I mean, they were fun to be around. A lot of them had kids of their own that they couldn't be with them. So they were, we actually wound up, when we were down here in Florida in Key West, we actually wound up swimming and playing with the Secret Service. The only thing my mother didn't like is they taught us to shoot pool. I don't think I really understood what it was to be a president's grandson until I got old enough to appreciate it for what good I could do with it. And I think other presidential children, grandchildren, feel this way. You have two jobs, really. Your first job is to help preserve your grandfather or father's legacy, but also to take that legacy and do with it what you can to make things better.
Yes. Well, certainly we've all, and you have, learned and read books about your grandfather and heard others speak of him and their relationship with him, the impact they've had on their lives. But looking at him purely as your grandfather, what are some of your early memories of him that have lingered about him as a person, as a man, as an influence in the grandfather capacity?
Well, you had to watch out for him early on. You had to be careful. You either treated him with a great deal of respect or you avoided him because he would always he'd always try to teach you something. And when you're a little kid and you're on break from school, that's not necessarily what you're looking for. Early in my life, Grandpa came to visit us in New York, stayed down the street at a hotel, got up at 5:30 every morning, went for a 1-mile walk at a military pace, 120 steps a minute, came back, ate breakfast, grabbed the newspaper, and let himself into my parents' apartment and read until somebody woke up. And my brother and I were the first ones down one morning, and he was behind the newspaper. He didn't see us at first, so we started to walk into the den so we could turn on the television set, and he caught us. He said, "Where do you think you're going?" And I said, "Into the den to watch Bugs Bunny." And he said, "You don't want to do that." And I'm thinking, yes, I do. But he said, "No, I got a better idea." And he went into the den. He took a book down from the shelf, and he said, "You two come here and sit with me." But you didn't argue with him, so we sat down, and he started to read. And my mother came down a little while later and was stunned to see this sight. The two of us were not moving a muscle, just perched on either side of Grandpa while he read to us from a book that didn't have any pictures in it. And she said, "What are you reading to them?" Well, it turned out to be Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, at 6 o'clock in the morning to a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. Reading was important to him. So that's one of the earliest memories I have of him. He had a certain way he thought you ought to grow up and behave, and he'd do what he can to get it done.
Almost unique in the modern presidency. He left the bustle of Washington and the White House and the press of important decisions, and he returned to a small town in Independence, Missouri for actually a long and quiet retirement. Tell us about what the life was like for President Truman after his years in the White House.
He once said that there's nothing worse than an ex-president hanging around Washington, D.C. So he did go home. Independence was where, even during the presidency, Independence was where he could relax and be himself and feel at home. And he really fell right back into it, whether he wanted to or not. My grandmother, I guess it must have been the first spring they were home in 1953, she came to him and she said, "Harry, the lawn's getting a little leggy, grass is getting long, and you need to cut it." And he said, I hate cutting the grass. He did. He hated lawn work. And she said, yeah, well, you're not president of the United States anymore. You have to cut your own grass. And he didn't do it. And she nagged him, and he didn't do it. And she nagged him some more. And finally he went out there one morning, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and started the mower. And my grandmother looked out the window and almost died. It was Sunday morning, and everybody in town was going to church,
yes.
passing the house. And here's the ex-president pointedly not going to church, cutting the grass, and waving at everybody who went by so they'd see him. And my grandmother ran out there, and she cut off the mower, and she said, don't you ever do that again. And he said, okay. And that was the end of the grass
And
cutting.
that was the end of his grass cutting. That's great. I have heard a wonderful story. In fact, there's a great book about a trip they took. Tell us about that.
Yes, written by Matthew Algeo a few years back. I guess this is, again, that first summer, spring and summer of 1953. Grandpa and my grandmother went to visit friends back on the East Coast and drove. They just got in the car, threw the bags in, and drove across country. And, of course, stopped traffic and made police forces nuts all along the way because people would recognize him, and they would slow down on the streets. They'd get to hotels, and the hotel clerk would call everybody in town, the newspapers, everybody else, and the police would just have a terrible time of it. So it was he thought he could do it. He thought he could go back to being completely normal, but it didn't quite work.
I've also heard a wonderful story about a car that broke down in front of your grandparents' house.
Yeah, a man's car broke down right in front of my grandparents' home, and he didn't know where he was. There wasn't a sign. This is the 1950s. There wasn't a sign out front that it was the Truman home. So he walked through the front gate and up to the door, and he rang the doorbell, and my grandfather answered the door. And the guy said, my car broke down. Can I use your phone? And Grandpa said, sure. And the guy went in and called the local garage, and the garage said it was going to take him 15 or 20 minutes to get out there. So he said, thank you, I'll wait for you by the car. And Grandpa said, no, don't do that. Sit down, relax. So they sat in the living room and talked for 15 or 20 minutes, and finally the wrecker pulled up out front, and the man stood and thanked Grandpa, said, I appreciate the use of the phone, and I appreciate the hospitality. It's been nice talking to you. Thanks. Grandpa said, not at all. I hope everything works out okay. And the man walked out the front door, and he got halfway down the front steps. And he turned and looked back at my grandfather, and he said, you know something? And I hope you don't take offense at this, but you look a hell of a lot like that SOB, Harry Truman. And he was a little stunned when my grandfather just smiled at him and said, I am that SOB. I don't know where they went after that.
That's a great story. Well, your mom actually lived in the White House. We've talked about her playing the piano and the story of the leg of her piano going through the family dining room to the ceiling below. And she actually was a musician and a mystery writer. And, of course, you mentioned your father was the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, a famous reporter in his own right. Tell me about them and the influence they've had on your own life and career, and how your mother over time reflected about her years in the White House.
Well, it's funny with parents. Some people just follow their parents automatically into whatever job they have. Doctors' sons and daughters become doctors. I didn't know what influence my parents were going to have on me. I thought that I didn't know what I was going to do with myself, but I wasn't particularly thinking of being a writer or a performer. And the next thing I knew, I'm both. It's really odd. I was a journalist for 15 years, and then in public relations for 15 years. And since I've taken retirement from that, I've been doing speeches about giving lectures about my grandparents, and also playing my own grandfather on stage in the one-man show, Give 'Em Hell, Harry, which James Whitmore originated back in 1975. So I'm always kind of surprised that I wound up sort of being both my parents. So the influence was much greater than I expected it to be. But they kept our lives as normal as possible when it came to being related to a president, when it came to politics in Washington. We were not encouraged to go into politics at all. My grandfather, in fact, he said once in an early article when he became a grandfather that he'd be okay if I wanted to be a senator, that would be fine, but he'd never wish president on me or anybody else.
How does it fall to the children or grandchildren of a president to address, speak to, defend decisions and actions and policies of their famous grandfather, father, president?
In my friends among that community, and it's a club. We keep joking that we're gonna have cards made and badges and meetings. Folks like people that I have done events with and call friends, Susan and Mary Jean Eisenhower, Susan Ford Bales,
Yes.
Margaret Hoover, Linda and Lucy Johnson. We've all done events at each other's institutions and worked together. And I find a similar attitude towards all of us. You're proud of your ancestor, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, but you see what you can do to do something with that. For me, I'm the honorary chairman of the Truman Library Institute, which is affiliated with the Truman Library. I'm also secretary for the board of the Truman Scholarship Foundation. But I've also, on my own, gone to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and tried to work on some reconciliation efforts along that line, which was not expected, came to me. So you take it, hopefully, and you make it your own and you do something productive with it.
If you could have dinner tonight with your grandparents, President and Mrs. Truman, what would you like to talk with them about?
Oh, God, anything. I would like it to be fun. They both had a great sense of humor, and they were both very blunt and very straightforward in their assessments of people and history and things. That would just be fun to be able to sit down with them and just let it go. Where I would expect a lot of laughing and would encourage that because they were great people to be around.
I'd like to come back to the main topic of our conversation, and that is the major restoration of the White House undertaken and achieved by President Truman. There came a point where this was complete and it was time to move back into the White House. And tell us about that experience and moving back in and how he felt about that achievement and accomplishment. It's a legacy of his that is extraordinary, and First Families in our country is indebted to him for what he took time and made a priority to achieve. But what do you know that he felt about that achievement?
Well, an enormous sense of pride for all of that. That he had done what he thought was right, preserving the outer walls, preserving the symbol, and frankly updating a building that needed to be updated, was badly in need of work, and creating what is now the modern White House. But even with all of the sub-basement levels and all of the really amazing things that go on that building, in that building, its power, the best thing about that building are those walls, those original walls. It's the White House. It's the symbol, among other symbols of this country, the Capitol, the Washington Monument. But the power of that building is in what was originally built by George Washington and others that got this country off on the right foot.
Well, thank you, Clifton, grandson of President Harry Truman, for taking the time to speak with us today about your grandfather and about your own experiences and memories growing up with such an important legacy. And I'm happy to remind everyone that today, on President's Day, we're unveiling the 2018 White House Christmas ornament at the Truman Library. This ornament will feature President and Mrs. Harry Truman and their legacy on and in the White House. You can learn more about the ornament and Clifton's upcoming talk at the association by visiting us anytime at our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks again to Clifton Daniel, and thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.